History rarely announces itself before it changes the world. Sometimes, a single missile, a single phone call, or a single meeting behind closed doors can redraw the map of an entire region. On July 29, 2026, while millions of people around the world were scrolling through ordinary headlines, the Middle East was quietly moving closer to one of the most dangerous moments of the 21st century. American warplanes struck targets inside Iraq. Saudi Arabia joined the operation. Iran's Revolutionary Guard answered with ballistic missiles. Jordan suddenly found itself intercepting incoming attacks. And inside Washington, Donald Trump sat down with Benjamin Netanyahu for what may become one of the most consequential meetings of this entire conflict. At first glance, these look like separate events. Another airstrike, another missile launch, another emergency meeting, another day in a region that has known conflict for decades. But what if every one of these events was connected? What if Iraq wasn't the real battlefield? What if Jordan wasn't the real target? And what if the most important decision wasn't made on a battlefield at all, but inside a conference room thousands of kilometers away? Tonight, we're going to connect every piece of this puzzle. We'll follow the missiles, the intelligence, the diplomacy, the military strategy, and the hidden calculations that almost nobody is talking about. Because by the end of this documentary, one question will matter more than any other. Was this simply another exchange of attacks? Or was this the opening move of a much larger war? And somewhere inside today's events, there is one detail, so small that most news reports mentioned it only briefly. Yet military analysts know that detail may ultimately explain everything. We'll come back to it. But first, we have to understand how this day actually began. For weeks, the region had been living under extraordinary pressure. Military forces across the Middle East that were already operating at heightened readiness. American naval assets remained deployed across strategic waters. Israeli forces continued preparing for possible escalation. Iran maintained a network of allied armed groups stretching across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond. Every government knew the situation was unstable. The only uncertainty was who would make the next move. Then, before sunrise, that move finally came. Reports emerged that American and Saudi forces had launched coordinated strikes against targets associated with Iran-backed armed groups inside Iraq. According to early reports, multiple facilities linked to militia operations were hit. The strikes were presented as a response to continued attacks against U.S. personnel and regional partners. For Washington, the message appeared straightforward. Deterrence, show strength, raise the cost of further attacks. But military operations rarely end where planners expect. Within hours, everything began changing. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed responsibility for launching ballistic missiles toward American military facilities in Jordan. Jordanian air defenses moved quickly. Several incoming missiles were reportedly intercepted before reaching their intended targets. The skies above one of America's closest regional partners suddenly became an active battlefield. And that changed the political equation immediately. Because once Jordan became involved, the conflict was no longer limited to Iran, Israel, or Iraq. Another country had been pulled directly into the crisis. But there was another question, one almost nobody was asking. Why Jordan? Geographically, it made sense. American forces operate there. Strategically, it also carried symbolic weight. Jordan sits at the crossroads of multiple regional fault lines. But experienced military planners often ask a different question. Not, where did the missile land? Instead, why was that location chosen? Because in modern warfare, targets are messages. Sometimes they're intended to destroy, sometimes they're intended to warn, sometimes they're intended to influence political decisions happening somewhere else. And this is where today's story becomes far more complicated than headlines suggest. Because while missiles were flying across the Middle East, another battle, one fought with diplomacy rather than explosives, was unfolding in Washington. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu were preparing for a high-stakes meeting at the White House. Officially, the agenda focused on regional security, Iran, and the widening conflict. Unofficially, analysts around the world were asking a much larger question. Were today's attacks timed to influence those talks? No government has publicly confirmed such coordination, but in international politics, timing is often as important as firepower. Military pressure can strengthen negotiating positions. Diplomatic meetings can influence military decisions. Sometimes, the battlefield and the conference room become two fronts in the same conflict. And if that was happening here, then today's missiles weren't just weapons. They were messages. Messages aimed at leaders, at allies, at adversaries, and at the wide world. Yet one element still refused to fit neatly into the picture: Saudi Arabia. For years, Riyadh and Tehran have oscillated between confrontation and cautious diplomacy. More recently, there had been efforts to reduce tensions. So why would Saudi Arabia now appear alongside the United States in military action linked to Iran-backed groups? Was this simply a tactical response to immediate threats? Or did it signal a deeper strategic shift that had been developing quietly behind closed doors? That question would become even more important as new information emerged. Because the strikes inside Iraq were not just about Iraq. They touched supply, proxy networks, energy security, and the balance of power across the entire Middle East. And hidden within those interconnected pieces was one strategic objective that almost nobody outside military circles was discussing. We haven't reached that answer yet. Once you see that hidden picture, today's events may look completely different. For most people, wars begin with explosions. A missile strikes. A fighter jet appears on television. Cities wake to the sound of sirens. And suddenly, everyone says, the war has started. But military planners know something very different. By the time the first missile is launched, the real war has often been underway for weeks, sometimes even months, because modern warfare isn't just fought with bombs. It's fought with logistics, fuel, intelligence, cyber operations, supply chains, and perhaps most importantly, preparation. So here's the question almost nobody asked after the strikes on Iraq. What had been happening before July 29th? Because when analysts began looking backward instead of forward, they noticed something unusual. Across the region, there had been a steady increase in military readiness. American surveillance flights became more frequent. Naval forces remained positioned near key maritime routes. Regional air defense systems were operating at elevated alert levels. Intelligence sharing between allies intensified. None of these actions alone proved that an attack was imminent. Governments often adjust military posture during periods of heightened tension, but taken together, they suggested something important. Decision-makers believed the risk of escalation was growing. The question wasn't if something would happen. It was when. And then, another clue emerged. It wasn't hidden in a battlefield. It wasn't hidden in a leaked intelligence report. It was hidden inside geography itself. Look carefully at the region. Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon. At first, they appear to be separate countries, separate governments, separate conflicts. But military strategists don't see borders the way civilians do. They see corridors, supply routes, air corridors, missile trajectories, fuel lines, communication networks. Every road, every airfield, every port, every mountain pass can become part of a military equation. And that's why Iraq matters so much. Not necessarily because of Iraq itself, but because of where it sits. It connects Iran to Syria, Syria to Lebanon, and Lebanon to Israel. For years, analysts have argued that this land corridor has been strategically important for Iran's regional influence. That assessment doesn't mean every convoy or shipment is known or confirmed, but it helps explain why Iraq repeatedly becomes a focal point whenever tensions rise. Because whoever influences that corridor can affect events hundreds of kilometers away. Suddenly, the airstrikes look different. Were they simply retaliation? Or were they also intended to disrupt infrastructure and networks considered strategically important? No official statement fully answered that question. But another mystery soon appeared, one that changed the conversation completely. Why was Saudi Arabia involved? Only a few years earlier, many observers believed Riyadh and Tehran were trying to reduce direct confrontation. Diplomatic contacts had resumed. Regional dialogue had increased. So why would Saudi Arabia now appear alongside the United States? Some analysts argue that governments can pursue diplomacy while simultaneously preparing for worst-case scenarios. Those two ideas are not necessarily contradictory. In geopolitics, countries often negotiate with one hand, while strengthening their defenses with the other. That may explain why today's alliances seem so complicated. Friends become rivals, rivals become temporary partners. Today's enemy can become tomorrow's negotiating partner, and tomorrow's partner can become next year's strategic competitor. Nothing remains permanent, except national interests. But perhaps the biggest surprise wasn't Saudi Arabia. It was silence. Because while headlines focused on missiles, another battle was unfolding almost unnoticed. The battle for information. Within minutes of the strikes, social media exploded. Videos appeared from multiple locations. Some were genuine. Others were old clips being reposted. Some claims spread globally before officials had even confirmed basic facts. In modern conflict, information travels faster than missiles, and that creates a new battlefield, one where perception can shape reality. Military commanders understand this. Governments understand this. Even financial markets understand this. Because if enough people believe something, the consequences become real, whether the original claim was accurate or not. Oil prices react, airlines reroute flights, embassies issue travel advisories, markets fluctuate, public pressure grows. One viral video can trigger decisions worth billions. Which raises another question. Was today's conflict only being fought on the ground? Or was it also being fought on every phone screen across the world? And then, another development quietly emerged. Commercial airlines began avoiding sections of Middle Eastern airspace. Shipping companies started reviewing routes near strategic waterways. Insurance costs began climbing. These weren't emotional reactions. They were financial calculations. Because companies that move cargo across the globe don't wait for governments to declare a crisis. They respond to risk, sometimes before politicians do, which means global businesses were already acting as though the situation had become significantly more dangerous. And that leads us to another mystery. If corporations were preparing for prolonged instability, what were intelligence agencies seeing that ordinary people couldn't? That answer remains classified, but history tells us one thing. Governments rarely reveal everything they know, especially during an active crisis. Some information protects ongoing operations, some protects intelligence sources, and some is withheld because revealing it could make the situation even worse. Which brings us back to Jordan. Earlier we asked why missiles were directed there. Now another possibility begins to emerge. What if Jordan wasn't chosen simply because American forces were present? What if it was chosen because of what Jordan represents? A stable ally, a geographic bridge, a hub for regional coordination. Striking near such a location then, if defenses intercept the missiles and send a strategic signal far beyond the physical damage. Again, that's an analytical interpretation, not a confirmed motive. But military history is full of examples where symbolism mattered almost as much as destruction. And if symbolism mattered here, then someone was trying to communicate something much larger than a battlefield victory. But communicate to whom? Washington, Israel, Saudi Arabia, or every government watching from a distance? We're getting closer. But one final clue changes everything. Because while cameras followed missiles over Jordan, very few people noticed what was happening. Thousands of kilometers away, inside financial markets, inside diplomatic back channels, and inside one meeting that may determine whether this conflict expands or begins to slow down. That meeting is where our story goes next. Because Chapter 3 isn't really about missiles. It's about Iran's long-term strategy, how the IRGC thinks, why proxy networks matter, and whether today's escalation fits into a broader regional playbook. And by the end of that chapter, you may start to see why this conflict isn't just about territory. It's about time. There is an old saying in military strategy: the side that forces its enemy to fight on its terms is already winning half the battle. For decades, Iran has understood one reality better than almost any other regional power. It cannot match the United States military plane for plane or ship for ship. America possesses larger carrier strike groups, stealth bombers, advanced surveillance, and a defense budget unlike any other nation on Earth. So if a direct conventional war would place Iran at a disadvantage, why would Tehran continue challenging Washington? The answer, according to many military analysts, is that Iran has rarely tried to fight America's war. Instead, it has spent decades preparing the battlefield for its own kind of war. Not a war of overwhelming firepower, but a war of patience, a war of pressure, a war where every move forces the opponent to spend more resources, make more difficult choices, and defend more locations at once. Imagine a chessboard. Most players focus on capturing the king. A grandmaster focuses on controlling the board. Many analysts argue that Iran's regional strategy follows a similar logic. Rather than relying on one decisive confrontation, it seeks to create strategic depth through relationships, influence, and regional partnerships. That doesn't mean every group in the region acts under Tehran's direct control. The relationships are often complex and vary over time, but together they have shaped the regional security landscape for years. And that's why today's events cannot be understood by looking only at today's missiles. To understand them, you have to go back, not days, not weeks, but decades. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran's leadership has viewed foreign military pressure as a long-term challenge. Over the years, sanctions intensified, diplomatic relations fluctuated, covert operations, cyber incidents, and regional conflicts repeatedly raised tensions. Rather than depending entirely on conventional military expansion, Iran invested in missile technology, air defenses, drone programs, and relationships across the wider region. Supporters describe this as a defensive strategy designed to deter stronger adversaries. Critics argue it has fueled instability by empowering armed groups beyond Iran's borders. Whichever interpretation one accepts, one fact is difficult to ignore. The strategy changed the balance of power in the Middle East. And then, drones entered the picture. A decade ago, many military experts viewed drones as supporting equipment, useful, affordable, but secondary. Today, that assumption has changed. Small unmanned aircraft can gather intelligence, conduct surveillance, and in some cases, carry out precision strikes. Compared with advanced fighter jets, they are often cheaper and easier to produce. Modern conflicts from Rome, Eastern Europe to the Middle East to Ojunave, shown how rapidly drone technology has evolved. The lesson has been noticed by militaries around the world, Iran included. But perhaps the most important lesson wasn't technological. It was psychological. Because expensive weapons are designed to be preserved. Affordable systems can be used more freely. That changes the calculus of conflict. And if today's battlefield rewards endurance as much as raw strength, then the side able to sustain pressure over time may gain an advantage. Which brings us to another question. What was Iran actually trying to achieve with the missile launches toward Jordan? Was the objective military, political, symbolic, or simply retaliatory? Publicly, Iran framed its actions as a response to attacks against its interests. Washington rejected that justification and defended its own operations as necessary for regional security. Those positions reflect the official narratives of the parties involved. But analysts often ask an additional question. What message was intended beyond the immediate military effect? Because sometimes, the audience isn't the country being struck. Sometimes, it's everyone else watching. Regional governments, global markets, foreign investors, potential allies, potential adversaries. Each missile can carry two payloads. One is explosive, the other is political. And then, another detail quietly emerged. Despite the rising tension, there was still no confirmed evidence that either side was seeking an immediate, all-out regional war. Instead, both appeared to calibrate their actions, responding, signaling, applying pressure, while also trying to avoid an uncontrollable spiral. That balance is extraordinarily fragile. History shows that conflicts do not always expand because leaders want them to. Sometimes, they expand because events move faster than diplomacy. A single miscalculation, a radar error, a mistaken identity, an interception that fails. History is full of wars that nobody intended until they began, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the greatest danger isn't a deliberate decision, but an accident? Now look again at the map. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf. Each flashpoint has its own history, its own politics, its own rivalries. Yet during moments like this, they become interconnected. Pressure in one place creates reactions somewhere else. And that interconnectedness is exactly why military planners worry about escalation. Not because every incident leads to war, but because every incident increases the number of variables. More actors, more weapons, more decisions, more chances for something to go wrong. And while the public watched the missiles, another contest continued almost invisibly. Diplomacy, emergency phone calls, military hotlines, back-channel communications, governments speaking publicly with confidence, while privately trying to understand each other's next move. Those conversations rarely appear on television, but they may matter more than any missile, because they determine whether tomorrow brings another strike or an opportunity to step back. Still, one question remains unanswered, perhaps the biggest one yet. If Iran's strategy is built on patience and the United States is responding with military force, then who actually benefits if this conflict continues? At first, the answer seems obvious. But in geopolitics, the obvious answer is often the wrong one, because wars reshape more than battlefields. They reshape alliances, energy markets, defense spending, diplomatic influence, even elections, which means there may be players influencing this crisis who are nowhere near the front lines. And one of those players is sitting inside the White House, preparing for a meeting that could redefine the next phase of this conflict. But before we walk through those doors, there is one final mystery. Remember the question we asked at the very beginning? What if Iraq wasn't the real battlefield? By now, you've probably realized something. The missiles, the airstrikes, the troop movements, they're only part of the story. The real contest may be taking place somewhere much less visible, where military decisions, political calculations, and global diplomacy intersect. And that is exactly where we're going next. Because in Chapter 4, we step inside the strategic calculations surrounding Donald Trump's meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, meeting that many believe could influence not just the next strike, but the direction of the entire crisis. While missiles were crossing the skies over the Middle East, another battle, far quieter, was unfolding inside Washington. No explosions, no fighter jets, no air raid sirens, just closed doors, national security briefings, military maps, intelligence reports, in one meeting that could influence everything that happened next. Donald Trump welcomed Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House. Officially, the purpose was clear: to discuss the rapidly escalating security situation, Iran, regional stability, and America's next move. But official agendas rarely tell the entire story, because every meeting between world leaders contains two conversations. One is public, the other never leaves the room. The cameras rolled, the handshakes were exchanged, prepared remarks were delivered. The message to the world was one of unity. America and Israel remain closely aligned in confronting security threats: strength, deterrence, coordination. Those were the words everyone heard, but experienced diplomats know something important. The most significant decisions are rarely announced while the cameras are still recording. The real negotiations begin after the journalists leave. Imagine sitting inside that room, around the table, military advisors, national security officials, intelligence chiefs, maps spread across large screens, satellite imagery, real-time battlefield assessments. Every hour, new reports arriving from the Middle East. Some confirmed, others still being verified. Every decision carrying enormous consequences, because one order could prevent a wider war or accidentally trigger one. And this is where leadership becomes extraordinarily difficult. Every option carries risk. Strike harder, and escalation becomes more likely. Show restraint, and opponents may interpret restraint as weakness. Respond too slowly, and allies begin asking uncomfortable questions. Respond too aggressively, and global markets panic. There are no perfect decisions, only imperfect choices. This wasn't the first time an American president faced such a dilemma. History offers countless examples. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, the campaign against ISIS. Every administration inherited different challenges, but one lesson remained remarkably consistent. Wars are much easier to begin than to end. Military planners can calculate missile ranges, fuel consumption, aircraft availability, probability of interception. But no computer can accurately calculate political consequences, because politics depends on people, and people are unpredictable. For Israel, the stakes were equally high. Successive Israeli governments have long argued that Iran's growing military capabilities and regional influence represent a major security challenge. Iran rejects that characterization and says its policies are defensive and aimed at protecting its interests. Those competing narratives have shaped years of confrontation. So from Jerusalem's perspective, every decision made in Washington mattered. How strongly would America respond? Would additional military support arrive? Would diplomatic pressure increase? Would there be new sanctions? Or would Washington attempt to slow the pace of escalation? Each possibility carried very different consequences. Most people assumed the meeting was about Iran, but what if Iran wasn't the only topic? Because every major geopolitical crisis creates secondary effects. Oil prices, shipping routes, military deployments, relations with Gulf states, NATO, Russia, China. Every major power was watching. Every intelligence agency was collecting information. Every government was recalculating strategy, which means Trump and Netanyahu weren't simply discussing today's attacks. They were almost certainly thinking about tomorrow, and next month, and next year. Because leaders don't just manage crises, they try to shape what comes after them. Now consider something fascinating. When two world leaders meet during a crisis, they're not only speaking to each other, they're speaking to everyone else. To Tehran, to Riyadh, to Moscow, to Beijing, to financial markets, to allies, to rivals. Every public statement becomes part of strategic signaling. Sometimes what leaders choose not to say becomes even more important than what they actually say. Silence can be a message. Ambiguity can be a strategy. Uncertainty can become a weapon. Military commanders often describe escalation as climbing a ladder. Each new action moves everyone one step higher. Airstrikes, missile launches, economic sanctions, cyber operations, naval deployments. Each rung increases pressure. But climbing down is much harder, because neither side wants to appear weak. That creates one of the greatest dangers in international politics. Not hatred, not ideology, pride. History has shown repeatedly that governments sometimes continue conflicts simply because reversing course becomes politically difficult. And that may be one of the greatest risks facing the Middle East today. After the meeting ended, news organizations focused on official statements. But one question received surprisingly little attention. What options were rejected? Think about it. For every decision announced publicly, dozens of alternatives were probably debated privately. Military strikes that never happen, diplomatic initiatives that remain confidential, warnings delivered through secret channels, requests made behind closed doors. We'll probably never know the full details. Perhaps not for years, maybe decades. History often reveals its biggest secrets long after the crisis has ended. Earlier in this documentary, we asked you to remember one small detail, that today's events appeared strangely synchronized. Airstrikes, missiles, diplomatic meetings, regional alerts. At first, it looked like coincidence. Now, the pattern is becoming harder to ignore. Because when military actions and political decisions unfold almost simultaneously, analysts began asking a different kind of question. Not, what happened? But, who wanted these events to happen at the same time? That doesn't automatically imply coordination by any single actor. In fast-moving crises, timing can overlap for many reasons. But it is a question that strategists continue to examine. And as we move forward, that question becomes impossible to ignore. Because while the world was focused on the White House, something equally important was unfolding far away from Washington. Not in Iran, not in Israel, not even in Iraq. It was happening in the world's energy markets, inside shipping companies, inside insurance firms, inside military logistics centers, places where wars are measured not by headlines, but by time. Because if this conflict continued, the battlefield would soon extend far beyond the Middle East. And that's exactly where our investigation goes next. In Chapter 5, we'll uncover the hidden battlefield Wu Ying he wore beneath the war. A battlefield without tanks, without trenches, sometimes without a single shot being fired, yet one capable of affecting billions of people around the world. When people imagine war, they picture soldiers, missiles, fighter jets, explosions, smoke rising over cities. But in the 21st century, some of the most important battles leave no visible crater, no burning buildings, no dramatic footage. Because modern war has evolved, today's conflicts are fought across 5 battlefields at the same time. The land, the sea, the air, cyberspace, and the global economy. Destroy one, and you weaken your opponent. Disrupt all 5, and you can change the course of history. And that's exactly why today's crisis is far bigger than the missiles seen on television. Because beneath every explosion, another war was already underway. Before a missile reaches its target, millions of people have already seen videos online. Some authentic, some edited, some entirely false. Within minutes, hashtags trend, rumors spread, markets react. Governments issue statements. In previous wars, winning meant controlling territory. Today, winning often begins by influencing perception. Military strategists call it the information domain. If you can shape what people believe, you may influence how governments respond. You may discourage investors, pressure politicians, reassure allies, or confuse adversaries. Every smartphone has become part of the battlefield. Every viral post can influence real-world decisions. The first casualty of war has always been truth. But today, truth travels more slowly than misinformation. And that's exactly why governments spend enormous resources monitoring the digital battlefield. Because one misleading video, shared millions of times, can create consequences almost as serious as a missile strike. Now imagine something. A country's air defense radar suddenly goes offline. Power grids begin failing. Airports lose communications. Banks stop processing transactions. Traffic lights malfunction. No bombs, no explosions. Yet an entire nation slows to a crawl. This is cyber warfare. Unlike conventional attacks, cyber operations often remain invisible. Governments rarely acknowledge them publicly. Evidence can be difficult to verify. Attribution can take weeks, sometimes months, and that uncertainty makes cyber conflict uniquely dangerous. Because if you cannot immediately identify the attacker, how do you respond? Military analysts have repeatedly warned that future conflicts are likely to include cyber operations alongside conventional military action. Whether or not such operations occurred during this specific crisis, every major military power prepares for that possibility. Because the battlefield of tomorrow may begin inside computer networks, long before soldiers cross borders. Now we arrive at one of the most strategically important places on Earth. A stretch of water so narrow, yet so important, that disruptions here can affect fuel prices across the globe. The Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through this corridor. That statistic alone explains why every escalation in the Gulf immediately attracts global attention. No government needs to completely close a waterway to create economic consequences. Even the perception of increased risk can raise shipping costs, insurance premiums, and energy prices. Markets react not only to what has happened, but to what they fear could happen next. And in times of uncertainty, fear can become a powerful economic force. This is why military planners don't think only about missiles. They think about shipping lanes, tankers, ports, refineries. Because energy has always been more than fuel. It is leverage. And whoever threatens global energy supplies, even indirectly, can influence decisions made thousands of kilometers away. Here's something many people never notice. Wars don't only consume ammunition, they consume money. Every interceptor missile fired costs money. Every aircraft sortie costs money. Every additional deployment costs money. Every day a conflict continues. Someone is paying the bill. Governments can sustain those costs for a time, but prolonged conflicts test budgets, industries, and political patience. Defense manufacturers increase production. Insurance companies reassess risk. Shipping firms change routes. Airlines burn more fuel, taking longer paths around danger zones. Global supply chains become slower, more expensive, less predictable. The battlefield reaches ordinary families, even if they live thousands of kilometers away. That's why economists often describe modern conflict as a global event, not merely a regional one. Now we come to perhaps the most secretive battlefield of all: intelligence. The public usually sees the outcome, rarely the process: satellite imagery, electronic surveillance, intercepted communications, human intelligence, open source analysis. Every major government gathers information around the clock, because the best military victory is often the one that prevents surprise. Think about it. Before an aircraft takes off, someone probably noticed increased activity at the airbase. Before missiles are launched, someone may detect unusual logistics. Before naval forces deploy, satellites observe movements. Modern intelligence doesn't eliminate uncertainty, but it reduces it. And in a crisis, that difference can save lives. Which raises a fascinating question. If intelligence agencies are watching so closely, how much of today's escalation surprised them? We'll likely never know. Some answers remain classified for decades. But one thing is certain. Every major power is studying this conflict, not only to understand today's events, but to prepare for tomorrow's. By now, you've probably realized something. The explosions are only the surface. Underneath lies a web of economics, technology, diplomacy, logistics, and intelligence. Missiles may dominate the headlines, but these invisible systems often determine how long a conflict lasts, who can sustain it, and who eventually gains the strategic advantage. That's why military historians often say, wars are not won by a single battle. They are won by endurance. At the beginning of this documentary, we asked 3 questions. Was Iraq the real battlefield? Was Jordan the real target? And was the White House meeting connected to something larger? By now, pieces of those answers are beginning to emerge. But one critical piece is still missing, the biggest one, because every conflict has a ripple effect. One country reacts, another adjusts, a third changes its military posture. Soon, an entire region begins shifting. That domino effect is already underway. And in the next chapter, we'll follow those dominoes, from Lebanon to Syria, to the Gulf, to Russia, to China. Because this conflict may no longer be about 2 sides. It may be reshaping the strategic calculations of the entire world. And hidden within those reactions lies the answer to the biggest mystery we've been building towards since the opening minute. There is a famous saying among intelligence officers: wars are never as local as they first appear. Every missile, every airstrike, every emergency meeting creates consequences far beyond the country where it happens. Like a stone dropped into still water, the impact spreads outward, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. The explosions in Iraq, the missiles over Jordan, the emergency talks in Washington. They weren't isolated events. They were the first dominoes. The question was no longer whether the crisis would spread. The real question had become, who would be forced to react next? Whenever tensions rise between Israel and Iran, one border immediately draws global attention: southern Lebanon. For decades, this narrow strip of land has remained one of the most heavily watched frontiers in the world. Military planners know that if violence expands there, the consequences could be immediate. Israel would need to divide military resources. Regional diplomacy would become even more difficult. International pressure would intensify. Even if no major escalation occurs, the possibility alone forces governments to prepare. And in military strategy, preparation changes everything, because resources sent to one border cannot be sent somewhere else. Just to the east, another complicated battlefield waits: Syria. After years of conflict, the country remains strategically important to nearly every regional power. Russian forces maintain a presence. Iran has long-standing ties with the Syrian government. Israel has repeatedly stated that it will act when it believes threats are emerging near its borders. The United States has also maintained a limited military presence in parts of the country. Now imagine all of those interests operating at the same time during an escalating regional crisis. One misunderstanding, one mistaken identification, one intercepted communication. The situation could change dramatically within hours. This isn't a prediction. It's the reason military hotlines exist, to reduce the risk of accidents becoming wars. Further south, another calculation was unfolding. The Gulf economies. These nations understand something better than almost anyone. Stability is not just political, it's economic. Ports, shipping, energy exports, foreign investment. Everything depends on confidence. If businesses begin believing that regional instability will continue, investments slow, insurance costs rise, trade becomes more expensive. Even countries that never fire a missile can still pay a heavy price, which explains why diplomacy often accelerates during moments of crisis. Not because governments suddenly become optimistic, but because instability is expensive, very expensive. While headlines remain focused on the Middle East, strategists in Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, and Washington were asking a different question. What does this mean for us? Because every regional conflict creates global opportunities and global risks. Russia, already balancing multiple strategic priorities. China, watching energy routes, global trade, and regional stability. European governments, concerned about energy security, migration, and financial markets. None of them could simply ignore what was happening, not because they wanted to become involved, but because globalization makes distance less meaningful than it once was. A conflict in one region can reshape economic decisions on another continent within days. Here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Sometimes, countries don't need to participate directly in a conflict to be affected by it. Every government asks similar questions. Should we adjust military readiness? Do we need new diplomatic initiatives? Should intelligence collection increase? Are supply chains at risk? How will markets react? Notice something. These aren't battlefield questions. They're strategic questions. Because modern power isn't measured only by military strength. It's measured by resilience. Who can adapt fastest? Who can absorb disruption? Who can protect national interests while avoiding unnecessary escalation? Those are the questions every capital city is quietly asking. Remember what I told you earlier? That one country, almost absent from today's headlines, could become surprisingly important. It isn't because that country fired the first missile or launched the first airstrike. It's because of geography, because of diplomacy, because of influence. Throughout history, certain nations have repeatedly found themselves acting as intermediaries, hosting negotiations, facilitating communication, or helping prevent misunderstandings between rivals. During crises, those quiet diplomatic channels often become just as important as military deployments. The public rarely notices them, because successful diplomacy rarely becomes breaking news. Only failure does. And that may be one of the greatest paradoxes in international politics. The most important conversations are often the ones nobody ever sees. Now, step back. Look at everything we've covered. The airstrikes, the missile launches, the White House meeting, the oil markets, the cyber domain, the intelligence battle, the regional reactions, the global calculations. Individually, they seem like separate stories. Together, they form a pattern, not proof of a single coordinated master plan, but evidence that today's crisis is unfolding across multiple dimensions at once: military, political, economic, technological, diplomatic. And when all of those dimensions begin moving simultaneously, history has a habit of accelerating. Before we move into our final chapter, I want you to think about something. We spent nearly 40 minutes examining missiles, leaders, alliances, markets, and strategy. But we've avoided answering one question, deliberately, because it's the hardest question of all. Who actually benefits if this crisis continues? At first, the answer seems obvious, until you examine the evidence. Because wars create winners and losers in ways that are rarely visible during the fighting itself. Some gain strategic influence, some lose economic stability, some strengthen alliances, others discover their vulnerabilities, and sometimes everyone pays a price. So, was this escalation inevitable? Could it have been prevented? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a much larger geopolitical transformation? Those are the questions we've been building towards since the opening scene. And in our final chapters, we're finally ready to confront them. Because every clue, every open loop, every unanswered mystery leads to one conclusion. But that conclusion is probably not the one you expect. For the last 40 minutes, we've followed missiles across the Middle East. We've examined military strategy, political calculations, intelligence operations, energy markets, and diplomacy. Piece by piece, the puzzle has come together. Now it's time to answer the questions we've been asking since the very beginning. But before we do, there's something important to understand. History is often misunderstood in real time. When people live through major events, they see headlines, breaking news, social media clips, conflicting claims. Only years later, when documents are released, memoirs are published, and classified material becomes public, does the full picture begin to emerge. So what follows isn't a claim that we already know every answer. Instead, it's the strategic picture that emerges from the confirmed events, the public statements, and the broader regional context. Because sometimes, understanding why something happened is even more important than understanding what happened. Remember our very first question? Was Iraq the real battlefield? After everything we've seen, the answer appears more complicated than a simple yes or no. Yes, the airstrikes happened there. Lives were lost. Military facilities were targeted. But strategically, Iraq represents far more than a single country. It is a crossroads, a place where the interests of regional powers intersect, where logistics, politics, and security overlap. Control isn't measured only by territory. It's measured by influence, by access, by freedom of movement. That's why developments inside Iraq often echo far beyond its borders. So perhaps Iraq wasn't the destination, perhaps it was the intersection. Then we asked another question. Why Jordan? At first, the answer seemed obvious. American forces operate there. But now, another interpretation becomes possible. Military strikes are often designed to communicate as much as they are designed to destroy. Target selection can carry symbolic value. A strike near an important ally can send a broader strategic signal. Again, we cannot know every intention behind every decision. Only those who made them know that. But the timing, the location, and the regional context suggest that the message may have extended well beyond the immediate battlefield. Now, the third question. The meeting between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Did it matter? Almost certainly. Not because one meeting alone determines the outcome of a conflict, but because diplomacy and military operations often evolve together. Leaders gather information, reassess risks, coordinate with allies, review intelligence, consider new options. Some decisions become public. Many never do. The meeting itself wasn't the story. It was one part of a much larger strategic process. Now step back one final time. The airstrikes, the missile launches, the emergency diplomacy, the oil market reactions, the cyber concerns, the intelligence race, the regional repositioning. Individually, they look disconnected. Together, they reveal something important. Modern conflicts no longer unfold in straight lines. They unfold in networks. One event influences another, which influences another, until the entire strategic environment begins changing. That's why today's wars are so difficult to predict, because nobody controls every variable. Every government acts, every rival reacts, every ally recalculates, and every decision changes the next one. Now, let's close the biggest open loop of this documentary. At the beginning, I asked you a question. What if this wasn't really about today's missiles? After examining everything, the answer becomes clearer. This crisis isn't defined by a single airstrike, or one missile launch, or one diplomatic meeting. It's defined by strategic competition, a competition over regional influence, deterrence, alliance credibility, security, Economic resilience and political leverage. The missiles were visible. The competition behind them was not. That's the hidden story. Not one secret plan, not one mastermind, but multiple governments pursuing their own interests at the same time, sometimes colliding, sometimes overlapping, sometimes escalating. The real battlefield was never just the sky above Iraq. It was the strategic decisions being made simultaneously in capitals across the region and beyond. History teaches one lesson over and over again. Wars rarely begin because one side wakes up and chooses chaos. More often, they emerge from cycles of action, reaction, miscalculation, and fear. One strike prompts another. One warning leads to another deployment. One deployment creates another misunderstanding. Until everyone feels they're responding, while nobody feels they're escalating. That's what makes crises like this so dangerous. Not certainty, uncertainty. There is one final question. Not for presidents, not for generals, not for intelligence agencies. For you. Years from now, when historians write about this period, what will they say? Will they describe it as another regional crisis that diplomacy eventually contained? Or will they describe it as the moment the geopolitical balance of the Middle East began to shift? Today, nobody can answer that with certainty because history is still being written. For nearly 50 minutes, we followed one story, or at least that's what it seemed like. Airstrikes in Iraq, missiles over Jordan, emergency meetings in Washington, oil markets reacting, military forces repositioning. On the surface, they appeared to be separate headlines, but now, you know better. They were chapters of the same geopolitical story, and now, only one question remains. What happens next? No one, not presidents, not generals, not intelligence agencies, can answer that with complete certainty. But based on history, military doctrine, and the strategic interests of the countries involved, three broad paths appear possible. This is the outcome diplomats hope for. Military operations slow. Back-channel communication intensifies. International pressure increases. Regional governments push for restraint. Neither side wants to risk a conflict that spirals beyond control. History offers many examples where crises reached a dangerous peak before gradually cooling through diplomacy and deterrence. If that happens here, the headlines will slowly disappear. The missiles will stop. Markets will recover. Governments will declare success. But that doesn't necessarily mean the underlying disputes have been resolved. It may simply mean they've been postponed. This is a scenario many analysts consider plausible. Not a full-scale regional war, but not peace either. Instead, a prolonged period of intermittent military actions, airstrikes, missile launches, cyber operations, economic pressure, diplomatic confrontation, each side trying to strengthen its position without crossing the threshold into an all-out war. We've seen versions of this dynamic before, periods where the conflict never fully ends, yet never fully explodes. For civilians, that uncertainty can be just as exhausting as open warfare. This is the scenario every military planner hopes to avoid, not because it's inevitable, but because the consequences would be immense. If multiple fronts expanded simultaneously, if diplomatic channels failed, if a major miscalculation occurred, the conflict could become far more difficult to contain. The humanitarian cost would be severe. Regional stability would be tested. Global energy markets could face renewed disruption, and international diplomacy would come under extraordinary pressure. This possibility is precisely why governments invest so much effort in crisis management, communication, and de-escalation. The honest answer is that nobody knows. Geopolitics is not a movie. There is no script, no guaranteed ending. Every decision made tomorrow changes the possibilities for the day after. That's why analysts focus less on predicting the future and more on understanding the incentives, capabilities, and constraints of each actor, because those factors shape what becomes possible. Remember the very first line of this documentary? History rarely announces itself before it changes the world. Now, think back to everything we've covered: the missiles, the diplomacy, the intelligence, The markets, the alliances, the public statements, the private calculations. The biggest revelation isn't that one side is winning or that another side is losing. The biggest revelation is that modern wars are no longer fought on a single battlefield. They unfold simultaneously across governments, economies, computer networks, shipping lanes, television screens, and the minds of millions watching around the world. The battlefield has expanded, and so has the cost of every decision. Years from now, students may open history books and read about July 2026. They may ask, was this the moment everything changed? Perhaps the answer will be yes. Perhaps it will be no. Only time will decide. But history has taught us something remarkably consistent. The most consequential moments rarely feel historic while they're happening. They feel confusing, incomplete, uncertain. Exactly like today. And that's why understanding events as they unfold is so much harder than understanding them in hindsight. Before we end, remember this. Missiles can destroy buildings, sanctions can weaken economies, armies can seize territory. But in the end, lasting peace has never been built by missiles alone. It has always depended on decisions. The decisions leaders make under pressure, the decisions nations make after conflict, and the decisions history ultimately remembers. Because long after the smoke clears, long after the headlines disappear, long after today's leaders are gone, the choices made during moments like these will continue shaping the world we leave behind.